We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, I'm going to be talking about the actual real reason why you may not be able to purchase a Rolex or a Patek Philippe watch. Now, many of you probably saw a video that was recently released by Teddy. I happen to think it was a really great video, really amazing in terms of quality and the content and also the animations. I think he did a great job. I think he usually, actually always, everything that I've seen from him, he does a great job. So this is no way any kind of a jab or a take or a gotcha type of video. This is more along the lines of a supplementation from my perspective of a watch dealer, having traded loads of Patek Philippe and Rolex watches and the things that I experience. And should shine a little bit more insight into kind of what happens between the authorized dealers, the gray market dealers, which myself is included in with Delray Watch. By the way, check out delraywatch.com, where we do have some Rolex watches in stock, no 5711s, but it's for a reason, and the reason I'm going to be sharing with you along with why there is actually not a Rolex or Patek Philippe shortage at all. That's right, you heard me say it. There, in my opinion, in my argument, is that there are actually not in the market any amount of shortages in terms of these watches. Patek Philippe and Rolex watches are readily available. You just need to pay the price. But first, please do not forget the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And let me know what you think about the background and the lights. I've been trying to spruce things up a little bit for you here in that regard. And on the wrist today, go figure, a Rolex watch, Rolex Always Perpetual 39 in red grape. I love this watch. So let's talk about, this perceived shortage. If you're not familiar, actually, please, I'll put a link below to Teddy's video because I think it does a really great job at especially explaining where we are today and how some of the interworkings work. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure to check that below because that'll give us a little bit of a starting point for this video. Wouldn't really necessarily want to reiterate some of the points because I think he does a great job at explaining it and animating this. But certainly over the last 5 years or so, especially, but increasingly so, even upwards of a decade, the Patek Philippe Nautilus watches, we're going to be looking at that, as well as the Rolex stainless steel sports models, including the Rolex Daytona with the ceramic bezel. These have been going up in desirability, and some claim that there is this shortage because you cannot just walk into an authorized dealer and buy the watch. The Rolex Daytona has always been a watch that was a little bit harder to get, at least in the last decade, of course increasingly so, but this was a watch that was not really in high production. Rolex, we know, produces about 1 million watches a year. Of those 1 million watches, we don't have accurate figures for the number of Daytonas, but Daytonas were not as common as something like a Datejust or something like a Submariner because it's a chronograph and someone had to really like the style to purchase it because chronographs for most people that were buying at that time 10,000, now upwards of 14 for, I believe, retail, it would need to be a function that you would either want to use or you really like the style. Otherwise, you may opt in for something a little bit more approachable like the Datejust or the Oyster Perpetuals of the time. Now, when we're talking about shortages in these watches, let's first examine the Patek Philippe 5711. Now, one can just go online and go to places like Chrono24 and quickly search 5711 1A, which is going to be the steel variant of the 5711. Now, just on Chrono24 alone, there are over 200, I believe, time of this shooting, 234 listings for the 5711 1A. This is not considering the different dial variations, but this is the stainless steel Nautilus. We'll lump them together. Now, if you go to other places like eBay and the forums and other common sellers that I go and look, and I'm sure you all do as well, the big sellers out there, there happen to be about 300 on the internet. Now, this is not even taking into consideration the amount of Patek Philippe 5711s that are in retail shelf stores if they're not online. This is not taking into consideration private sellers that may be selling them locally or on consignment. Or different consignment websites such as The RealReal, which are technically private sites. You can sign up very easily, but I'm not even including that. I just want to use 300 as a base number because that's all that I can accurately account for, but this is also going to make the math a little bit more conservative too, which I think really lends to support here the conclusion that there's really not a shortage. So I do have my laptop here for the math because I do want to get this accurate for you to really drive home the point that I want to make, where there's not a shortage, you just have to pay the price. The other thing to consider before I do the math here for you, or with you rather, is that there is a distinction between buyers, customers, consumers, collectors, right? That is one segment, but then you have this watch dealer slash flipper category. Now, there could be a collector that just happens to put a watch up for sale, like they happen to be someone that spends $1 million with a Patek Philippe boutique. This happens all the time. Think hedge fund managers, traders, things like that. These people exist, and it does happen, especially with a brand that only produces something like 60,000 watches a year, Patek Philippe. So this actually does happen quite often, and these are the guys that are getting the watches. They might put it up for sale, and that's why you see a private collector on something like a Chrono 24 trying to cash out. But there are this other distinction of dealers that are much in the similar category that either obtain it through authorized dealers or purchase from one of these people that don't want to list it and do the work themselves. So rolling back into the 5711 before I lose you here, on Chrono 24 and all the other places online, 300 examples, right? Patek Philippe produces 60,000 watches per year. And also, it's important to note that the president of Patek Philippe, when they recently discontinued the 5711 before the green dial came out as the last hurrah, they did make an announcement in an interview, a couple interviews actually, saying they never intended and they did not in the past make Patek Philippe a sports watch company. So they have 114 models existing currently with 60,000 watches per year. Now, even if we didn't divide the number of models by the number of watches they make per year to give us roughly how many 5711s they might make, we could even take it to a higher end and produce a range, something like 5%, right? There might be 5% of the 60,000 watches being the 5711 1A, but we'll take a range here. So either divide it evenly among those the models and the number of watches they produce per year, or at that range on the higher end, 5%, we're looking at between 526 to 3,000 Nautiluses per year, and the Nautilus 5711 was produced for 10 years before it was discontinued. Now the watch is discontinued, so we're looking at something like 5,200 to 30,000 pieces total of the 5711 1A probably to be in existence. Now I know this is a big range here, but this is what we have, and I think on either end of the range it's either the same argument really, but it just gets a little bit more extreme depending on where we are in the range and where we feel in terms of how many 5711s were actually produced in that range. So when you factor in that there's 300, we're just looking at the 5711s that are available online, 300, somewhere between 1 and 6% roughly of all the 5711 1As that were ever produced are available for sale online. Now, this makes me personally scratch my head a little bit, and I believe, now I'll let you comment in the comments below and chime in as well. I want to give you that ability and opportunity as well. Do you think 1 to 6% of the entire market of a watch that's really made for the casual buyer for sale at any given time, can we really consider that a shortage? Now the watches are out there for more than several times the retail price, depending on condition and provenance and box papers, all of that. But can we really think that 1 to 6% of the entire product ever made available for sale today is a shortage? In my opinion, no. It just means you have to pay what people are asking for, right? I'm not saying anything about the demand because people want the watch, but just because people want the watch, they still have to be willing to purchase it. And when we see hundreds of them available at my fingertips, I could buy 6%, if I was able to, I could buy 6% of all 5711 1As that Patek Philippe ever produced right now, today, wire transfer, potentially even credit cards on Chrono 24. In my opinion, I just don't see that as really a shortage. It just means you have to pay more. People are putting these up, trying to get more money for it, but something we do need to keep in mind, and the distinction is here, just because someone is asking does not mean they are receiving until they do receive, they do make the sale, and they do complete the sale. Now, this is just 5711, and we have to consider that Patek Philippe, once again, 60,000 watches per year. So, I think it's easier to make the argument there on that end for someone to say that there is a shortage just because there are much less out there. And let's face it, the 5711 1A, setting aside a couple of Richard Milles, is probably the hottest watch in existence today in terms of modern watches. It is discontinued, but still modern watch, almost within production recent times. Now, we can also look at the 116500, the ceramic bezel Rolex Daytona. We'll lump in both of the dial variations, the black and the white. Once again, have my laptop here. There are 713 available online for sale, and that's just looking at Chrono 24 at the time of the shooting. There are other places where this watch is available. We could go up even more, but using a similar way that I calculated the math previously, if you could buy the watch at your fingertips from pretty much anyone at the market price, personally, in my opinion, I just don't think that that's really a shortage. In my head, a shortage would be something like there is a component that's scaling back the building of something, right? Think of homes. They can't build enough homes to keep up with people that need a place to live because there might be the lumber that's not able to be imported, or things like that where truly you just couldn't buy a home in a certain market. Think of maybe some hot neighborhood. I'm not a real estate guy, but let's say, I don't know, someplace out in LA or New York, there's just not more land, right? So if you want to live in a neighborhood, you just can't buy a home because they're just not on the market. Whereas in this situation that we have here, they're all on the market. The market has dictated the price of what people are willing to accept today for the watch. Hundreds of them available, upwards of 6% of the market when we're talking about 5711. In my mind, if I can buy it today, hundreds of them, 6% of the market, or a little bit less than that in terms of the Daytonas because they produce more watches, million watches per year. Who knows what percentage is Rolex? I just don't see that as a shortage. Do you? Let me know in the comments below. Once again, this is in no way a jab or anything like that. This is just a different way that I personally think about it as someone that trades watches. And when you get into some of the watches that we trade, some of these watches are produced in low numbers, right? Get into the Dufours, get into some of the more vintage watches that are truly produced in limited small quantities. You start thinking about what percentage of the market could you own or might you want to own. So this is really my thought process. It's in no way saying other people are wrong, but really I would like to hear your opinions because you guys are the people that are posting them on Chrono 24. You are the ones that maybe get on the wait list. You're the ones that are buying the watches, along with myself as a fellow watch geek, but I always like hearing what everyone has to say and engaging in this kind of discourse. And additionally, if you do watch the video, I want to comment about international Rolex authorized dealers and how that works. I'll share a story. Recently, I have a friend who is in South America. He's from South America. He went into an authorized dealer that he actually had a really great relationship with through his family and through connections, right? So he's getting the best experience already walking in through the gate, walking in through the door, and he comes to tell me, and this is something I already knew, but I'm just kind of putting this in a story format for you. He tells me, oh, they have all these Rolex watches in stock, sports models. And so we go on to talk, and it turns out, even though he had family, friends, and connections, they're offering the watches at what would be the market price that you would see on Chrono 24, not the suggested retail price. Now, certain countries have different tax and VAT and luxury tax and things along those lines, but nonetheless, the authorized dealers in some countries can really get away with this, and this is not something that Rolex is going to walk through the door because business is done in different places, different ways. It doesn't matter if you're Rolex, it doesn't matter if you were the government there, it doesn't matter if you were the central bank in that country. There's different standards, ethics, and practices in different places of the world depending on belief systems, the history, and a multitude of other factors, right? I'm not an economist, but you get the idea here, is that just because a watch comes from an authorized dealer doesn't necessarily mean it has to come at that price. And following that train of thought, let's talk about the watch boxes that are connected to authorized dealers like Govberg. Let's talk about the Bucherers. Let's talk about the Tourneaus, where they're both heavily invested in pre-owned and new. Imagine you walk into a Tourneau, now to be renamed, but let's pretend you had walked into a Tourneau previously and you bought a Rolex Daytona for whatever it was at the time, let's say $14,000 flat. They gave you a deal. They liked you a lot. Well, you didn't like it the next day. You walked it in, you traded it in as pre-owned with the stickers off and maybe a little hairline scratch somewhere on the clasp, a little diving mark. And then you turn it back into them and they pay you more than you paid for it the next day because they're going to turn around and sell it for, at that time, maybe 1.5 retail, but now double retail, right? Double dipping. And so there becomes this real gray line. Now, I'm not saying that authorized dealers out there are using proxies or they're intending to use proxies to make more profit margin, because on a lot of these watches, there's a bigger margin when you start getting into pre-owned. I mean, look at what the big players do, the publicly traded companies. Look how they're getting into pre-owned. The margins are there compared to working with the brands. That's for sure. So I'm not saying that they're purposefully using these proxies to kind of pad their pockets, but effectively that's what happens, right? You walk into a Tourneau, you buy the watch, you walk into another Tourneau, or you work with a different salesperson at the counter, you trade it in as pre-owned. Now you're in a separate segment. They can buy it back and sell it for much more. They're not even bound to any terms or agreements with the brand. They effectively circumvent the whole thing. And this is something that Rolex commented on a few years ago, and they didn't seem to have a problem with pre-owned doing this. Now, do they behind the scenes? That is to be told as time unfolds. Some brands do have a problem and they crack down, and they'll even send us little nasty emails at Del Rey Watch. By the way, we have so many interesting pieces that we just taken in on stock, but sometimes these brands, they try to fight it, but the times are changing and the market just is what it is. But one thing is for certain is that if you wanted a 5711 1A by Patek Philippe, doesn't matter the dial, or you wanted a Rolex, anything, Rolex du jour, you can buy it. You just need to be prepared to pay the market price. Let me know what you think, comments below. Once again, please check out Teddy's video. I do think that he did a really great job. The production is absolutely killer. It reminds me of something like a History Channel episode. Really, they've done a great job. So in no way a dig at him, just providing some supplementation from my experience and how I view the watch industry as someone that does this every day. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.